almost fed and at least seated, and it's fine if you continue with your lunch. I'm glad to see that neither the change in program nor the change in venue discourage you from coming. I'm delighted that that all worked out. A very special thanks today goes to today's speaker for filling in for our original speaker, Annie Cohen-Salal, who had to return unexpectedly to her home in Paris earlier this month. It was a challenge to find a person, and in short order, who, while dealing with quite a different artistic subject, could meet the high standards that we have set for our World Affairs seminars. Enter Gregory Hunt, the founding dean of School of Architecture at Marywood. You can imagine that his schedule is dauntingly busy and that it would be unfair to ask him to craft a talk that was not stashed in his archive of past lectures that would fit the bill for our World Affairs series. In short, he was dauntingly busy, and it was unfair to ask him, but I'm happy to say I did ask him, and he did accept, and that he has come to speak to us today on Museums as Civic Architecture, a Global Perspective. Architecture is that art form that is almost totally public, and civic architecture is at the very core of our most beautiful cities, Rome, Paris, Athens, Washington, to mention a few, and state capitals, city halls, courthouses, post offices, and yes, museums. Museums don't fit precisely into the category. They are not necessarily public in the same way. They may not be publicly owned. They may be in the private nonprofit category. However, they are clearly public spaces that exist for the public good, whose mission is to preserve and display works of art or artifacts of history, science, or any other particular domain that are considered worthy of being preserved and exhibited. In his illustrated presentation this afternoon, Dean Hunt will explore the differences in the design and perhaps the intended impact of the design of several internationally acclaimed museums that represent contemporary civic architecture in this global era. Prior to assuming the founding dean's position at Marywood, Greg Hunt was dean of the School of Architecture at the Catholic University of America. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Sandra. It's always hard to be a fill-in, and no, I didn't pull this out of the drawer, I can assure you. And with that, I have to make an initial disclaimer, well, actually two. One is that when I was a full-time teacher, I always promised that I would never, to myself, show buildings I hadn't visited. Well, of course, I had to break that rule because now I sit behind a desk, and it's not a desk in a studio, it's in an administration office. The second disclaimer, in a way, is that I probably have an hour-and-a-half lecture here, so forgive me if I have to go very fast, or do go very fast through the images, because I always like to have image-laden presentations. But I have to say that, and I've told her this privately, that if you need a good copy editor, pick Sandra Myers. She's extraordinary. We probably went through 5, 6 iterations in what to put into the little bulletin about describing this, and every time I'd said something in, I'd say, that's the last one, that's got to be it. And she'd say, well, what about, and it's been extraordinary working with you on that, because it's just really made me come to see how important the written word, of course, is, particularly if it's used well. This subject is dense. I'm going to try to sort out, and I've got a strategy for doing it that I hope you'll accept. I'm going to start with this, and can you see okay here, Maggie? When we talk about civic architecture, I want to focus really, perhaps not outwardly, on 3 things: purpose, aesthetic, and the creation of place. I think that each of the projects I'm going to show you, I think there are 6 or 7, represents, I think, a various combination of these words. Now, I recognize that those of you that appreciate the English language, there are multiple ways to interpret words. I'm very sensitive to that. But I ask your forbearance in the way I'm going to set up a certain condition, which I'll get to in a second. But if you were to walk down Fifth Avenue in New York, and I'm sorry about the light leak, The Metropolitan Museum of Art, a neo-Renaissance building at 82nd Street, designed in 1880 with fairly typical classical arrangement of rooms, represents, I think, what at that time embraced the idea behind a museum, particularly in America. Americans, certainly the people of means, felt that we had to have cultural symbols and civic architecture that would certainly be equal to those of the rest of the world, particularly Western Europe. Therefore, the range of artifacts stored in, for example, the Metropolitan Museum range from sarcophagi to actually a dismantled living room from the Little House in Minnesota by Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1950s, and everything in between. Now, if you go up to 92nd Street, you find a different kind of building, also a museum, but a museum designed, believe it or not, in 1945 for Solomon Guggenheim's collection of non-objective art, and it's called the Guggenheim New York, as you know. Now, as an external form, it introduced a radical aesthetic. Actually, the building was so radical that it took Robert Moses and every ounce of persuasiveness he could muster over a decade to get the building department to approve this particular structure because it was so radical in its structural design. Nobody had done cantilevers like this, a continuous wrapped a balcony, et cetera, on the inside. But it was, again, for a collection of non-objective art. So I think that once you start looking at the purpose of the building and the contents of the building, you'll probably agree that that aesthetic certainly had to be different. Now, I'm going to start off with a taxonomy. A taxonomy is simply a little classification system. I'm going to ascribe certain words that I think are prevalent in the following projects. And I'm going to start with the idea of museum as machine. In Place Beaubourg in the 1970s, there was an international competition that was won by two very young architects, Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, a Brit and an Italian. They teamed up and worked with another gang of young people. When they got notice that they had won the international competition for this new museum of art in the Marais section of Paris, once a very, very wealthy address, if you will, of the elite of Paris, but at the time a rundown, not slum, but certainly a different, an area of Paris that had gone down economically and culturally in a certain sense. But these folks were so young that they had to borrow suits to go to Paris to accept the award from Georges Pompidou at the time. And as you can see, the building is like nothing that had appeared before. Nobody had ever seen a building like this, certainly as a museum. It was, in fact, and again, I apologize for the light, a building that showed all of its parts, how it's made, how the water ran from floor to floor, how the structural system worked, or gerberettes, these cantilevered elements, an ecoskeleton, but it was all expressed on the outside like a living, breathing machine. Key to this idea of building as machine in the case of the Pompidou Center, or Centre Pompidou, is this elongated escalator that winds its way up the height of the building. This was a public escalator. Its idea was that you could start from the ground, not buy a ticket for entrance into the museum and the internal parts of the building, but ride all the way up to the top for a majestic view over the roofs of the Marais. One of the things that critics decried was that after only 20 years of use, the building had to be totally renovated. The reason for that is that they expected 5,000 visitors a month. They received 25,000 per month. This was an extraordinarily successful civic event and piece of architecture. Key to this is the Grand Plaza that you can see in the foreground of this slide. And some of you might have seen Michael Kimmelman, the New York Times architecture critic, recently wrote about the significance of the physical places in the current insurrections in the East, or in the current Occupy Wall Street in the park. I've forgotten the name of it, but these physical places, even though assemblies are now being done through social networking, phones and tweets and whatnot, we still need these physical places to voice what we feel about democracy or the lack thereof. Again, I hope you can see it, but the structure, the mechanical systems, all outboard, all for easy replacement, really. Even the ventilation stacks to bring in air for the mechanical equipment become 30-foot tall sculptures along the sidewalk. The inside, and again, it's too bad. We need to get some light blocking curtains, David, on this fundraiser, maybe soon. The inside, I think, has been likened to a grand convention hall. It's really a big warehouse space. Now and critics have decried it for that reason. It's not like a Renzo Piano, for example. I'll show you one of his buildings in a moment, but it's a big, hard-working machine, easily transformed, very flexible, can handle a lot of crowds, etc. But that was its purpose, that was its function. At the very top, after you wind your way up through the plexiglass enclosed escalator, constantly running, is this wonderful view in the very bottom of both the Plaza down below and of the rooftops of Paris. And when I looked at this slide at the bottom, it occurred to me that in 1889, for the Paris Exposition, Gustave Eiffel, the engineer, designed the Eiffel Tower. Now what's rather remarkable is when you realize that the Eiffel Tower at that time was the tallest man-made structure from which you could see the surface of the Earth. So in a way, I think there's a historical, this is an antecedent, I think, that was an antecedent, I think, for this idea of going up to see what's around you down below in Paris. And my last slide for this building as machine, is this competition elevation. Elevation is just a picture of the front of the building. You might notice that across there's a horizontal band. You have to take my word for it, but across here, the architects proposed giant TV screens to bring instant news, images, photographs, etc. Georges Pompidou said, if you win this, and Philip Johnson was on the jury, everybody loved this scheme, but the Prime Minister said there's one condition: take the TV screens off the side of the building. He was worried about insurrections. Very interesting observation. So the machine then could have been this great device that would, Lord knows what, if people decided to go against the government, etc. So they were not built. Now let's look at I.M. Pei, his addition to the Louvre, which I classify as building as geometry. Now, this was an extraordinary commission for an American, a Chinese American. The French were not happy with the choice by the government. Pei took several months, apparently, to decide to accept the commission. But its purpose is really quite straightforward. It's not really a museum as such. It's an entrance to a myriad set of hallways and corridors and circulation routes to the various wings of this Napoleonic court. A gigantic building. It stretches over 1,200 feet from end to end. And what you might expect would be the case, architects, whether they're designing a museum or a house, very often fall back on some same fundamental formal strategies. And this is certainly a case in point. What Pei did, as you can see from these sketches, was to look at the geometric alignments of the paths of the buildings, the center lines of the buildings, and as he did with the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art, he called on geometry to be his agent, if you will, for the design. He gets a crystalline, pure form, the pyramid, surrounds part of it with a reflecting pool that obviously has significant visual effects, particularly at night. But it becomes an extraordinary magnet for people that might come to the museum, but might just also come to occupy the square in the upper left. I show you then 3 images, including the skylight in the great court. Probably the most beautiful concrete pouring, quality of concrete, I think in the United States is in this building. It took pink Tennessee marble, dust, and mixed it with the concrete and got this pinkish hue, and it's really quite an extraordinary structure. But the point is, he drew on the same formal agents, as I'm calling them, from his earlier schemes for many of his buildings. And of course the apex is inverted down below to bring light in. The same structure is used. But there's no question that the Louvre, I think, historically remains an exquisitely built, exquisitely designed, magical counterpoint to the masonry architecture that surrounds it. We do have occasion to build precincts of civic buildings. In Fort Worth, Texas, we have a precinct that includes Philip Johnson's Amon Carter Museum, Louis Kahn's Kimball Museum, and across the street, the building I'm going to focus on, is the Museum of Modern Art by Tadao Ando, an architect that hasn't built much in this country. The Pulitzer in St. Louis is one, the little art building at Williams College in New England, but not a prolific amount of work, or hasn't been prolific certainly in this country since he has been, but he's of course doing hundreds of buildings in Japan and elsewhere. But in this case of the buildings as precinct, I think the point I'm trying to get at is that the design of the buildings, they're somewhat insular, they're self-referential, they are all in a park, in this case in Fort Worth. And what Ando faced was a building right across the street from this absolute gem of 20th century American architecture, the Kimball Museum of Art by Louis Kahn from 1972. Kay Kimball's art collection was small. You couldn't put Guernica by Picasso, for example, in these galleries, as you can see from the interior. He had what he calls silver light and green light. He brings light in from the top. And one of the remarkable things to me is that the then curator in the pre-program document given to Louis Kahn said that he wants the museum visitor to be, quote, part of the real, rotating, changeable world. And when you think about that, that's exactly what Kahn gave the client. When a cloud passes between the sun and the building, the light levels go down, because so much of the ambient light of the gallery is seen in this interior photograph washes off a perforated stainless steel device that blocks the sun but allows the light to wash the cycloidal vaults, they're really curved beams, to bring a magical sense of light to the interior of this museum. Small scale again because of the size of the collection. So Ando's building, you can see on the left, the Kimball is here, this large property, very verdant, with a pool and 5 bars of bays. There were 6 here. Ando wanted to have 6. You have to understand that with Kahn's Kimball Museum, for any other architect to be within even the sight lines of that building is a daunting challenge, even for people like Richard and David and Bill and other architects in the room. But you have to be a little squeamish to take something like that. Now, here comes Ando with a Japanese sensibility. He loves concrete. In fact, when he built his first structure outside of Chicago was for a private patron doing a house. The story is that he poured a 100-foot long wall of concrete. Ando came to look at quality and ordered the whole thing be torn down and rebuilt. So this is an extremely disciplined fellow. Never went to architecture school, was a boxer, a truck driver, et cetera, but just an extraordinary, doesn't help me to tell students that, but again, the clarity, it's unfortunate, but the Japanese principle of Engawa, in between spaces, the quality of light, the magic of the repose of the water, reflectivity, et cetera. It's basically a glass box on the outside with these overhanging slabs of concrete carried on these wishbone columns, as you can see. And I think the sketch, and I'm sorry I don't have a Frank Gehry sketch of the last project I'm going to show, which is the Guggenheim Bilbao, because I'm convinced that the way architects sketch in the final buildings, Ando is about spatial sequence and space, as you can see in the lower left. That's a perspective sketch that's about seems to me, it's about the skeletal columns, the overhanging slabs, the glass, that's it. The 3 constituent parts of the entire building. The inside is, what's interesting is that if you go online to get interior photographs of many of these buildings, you don't find many. And I'll just sort of leave that for your rumination because I think there's something very telling about it. We become so visual that it's the aesthetic of the outside that seems to have greater bearing. which I think is certainly false. But here again, you see the wishbone columns carrying the overhanging slabs. The galleries on the inside, I think, are fairly pedestrian. I don't think they have anywhere near the magic of the Kimball. But then again, I think the overall ambience is one of reflection, tranquility, repose, and great beauty. Now, you probably have gleaned from now that, of course, machine, place, geometry can apply to any building. But this taxonomy, frankly, is just self-imposed as a way of trying to get the attribute that I think stands alone as being the most important. The architect that's got a lock on American museum design is this little fellow from Genoa, Italy, who has an office in Paris named Renzo Piano, the co-author of the co-designer of the Beaubourg, the Centre Pompidou. Addition to the Kimball Museum, addition to the Morgan Library, addition to the Art Institute in Chicago, which I'm going to show you, the High Museum by Richard Meyer in New York, the Gardner Museum, Isabel Stewart Gardner's Museum in Boston, the Byler Museum in Basel, the de Menil in Texas, the Whitney in New York, and the Paul Klee in Switzerland. Nobody does it better. Now, I think that with the plethora of buildings like that, he has spent so much time, I think, from the de Menil collection on, looking at how to get natural light into a building, to control it, to keep it at bay, to keep it not to be injurious to, prevent it being injurious to the artwork. But here we have the Art Institute, a venerable institution in American culture, along Michigan Avenue. Millennium Park is on this side where the Frank Gehry orchestra shell is. But you can see, I think, from the lower right, the concept is fairly simple. Some limestone sheathed solid walls, glass walls for light in the galleries, laterally, and then this overhanging scrim of light on the top, the overhanging broad sheltering roof. It's become almost signature for Piano, but I think on this particular site, I've only seen it under construction, not since it's finished, but this is the view from, at night, of course, from the park. But you can see, again, the skeletal pieces of the building, the components. The limestone matches the solid walls of the Art Institute, but you can see the technology, the slenderness of the columns, all very much about the 21st century. And even in terms of interior planning, you have grand halls, main circulation spaces, very much of our time, and yet I think feeling very comfortable next to a building like the 19th century Art Institute. But look at that gallery. Not hermetic, open to the city, presenting all kinds of technical challenges with light. But this is an architect who's spent over decades, or a decade and a half roughly, investigating, testing, experimenting with the admission of light to, and you can see the Frank Gehry building in the distance, perhaps. You can see it, I can see it fine here. Building as vessel, I'll go through this. Stephen Holl, I had to get some Americans building. There was a competition in Helsinki in the 80s that Stephen Holl, a New York architect, educated at Seattle School of Architecture in Washington. This is a hermetic building. There are many, many others like it, but it was a competition winner. It's a building that sits next to a major road, as you can see. To the very right is a part of Elil Saarinen's rail station, and in the very back, those of you that know Helsinki, is Alvar Aalto's culture, place of culture, the House of Culture, the slope roof back here. A difficult site, a very difficult site to be sure. Not a whole lot to say about it other than the fact that its geometry and its shapes really wrap the internal spaces. They don't seem to have much consequence on the exterior, although its certainly lines are clean. The building, though, is, as I said, hermetic. It sits in a greensward, but nothing like some of the other buildings we've seen or will be seeing. This is also a master watercolorist who does countless studies like this to look at the spatial sequences of the interior spaces as well. Now, what about buildings as an event? Santiago Calatrava has not built very much. He's a Spanish engineer and architect. But on the shores of Lake Michigan in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is the Milwaukee Art Museum shown here. It's actually in addition to a building, part of which was done by Eliel Saarinen in the 1930s, I believe it was, or 40s. It sits right next to the water, as you can see. Its form language is certainly unique. There's a tension-stayed bridge supported on those cables that goes across the road, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, toward this great sail. And the purpose of that is it's a sunscreen that actually will go down like the wings of a bird to close up at night in inclement weather. It takes 3.5 minutes, automated, computer-driven, etc. But Calatrava, I almost said Ando, talked about the fact that he was influenced by the seagulls on the water, the boats, and the changing weather and light next to the lake. And as you know, some of you that have been on the Great Lakes, it can be tranquil and placid, or it can be brutally rugged and otherwise. So you can see the great sail in this image, hardly any straight lines. The interior actually does not have a great deal of space for exhibitions. I had an occasion to talk to a gentleman on a plane a few years ago who happened to have been on the board. And we started talking about this museum, and he confided in me and said that, well, they spent so much money on the museum that they didn't have any money to buy art. Which leads me to something else that's a reality about this great, enormous urge to build museums all over the world for cultural events, for people, for birds, whatever it is that in terms of art, we're now down to 4th level art because the good stuff is gone. So these little smaller town or small city institutions have a hard time unless they have a well-bequeathed collection already established. They're picking up third and fourth class, let's say, artwork, which I think is really rather sorry. Here's a time-lapse series of photographs, 9 of them. On the upper left, the wings are closed. It might be a stormy day or something, or very sunny. And then you can see at the very bottom, the bird's wings stays up. So it's pretty clear that as you walk toward this over the bridge, this is the cable-stayed bridge, you're walking toward this big sail and you can see the lake beyond. So the metaphor is not lost. And obviously, again, with many of these buildings, they become iconic, especially at night. And it's buildings like this, and of course the last one we'll see, the Sydney Opera House in Australia, becomes a symbol of a city. So these iconic buildings, even though I'm talking about this as a building as an event, really take pride of place in many ways, from postage stamps to stationery to fundraisers for the city. But people identify with a piece of architecture as being their city, of their city. Now this is a tough one. Museum is narrative. This is the Jewish Museum in Berlin by Daniel Libeskind. It's a deconstructivist building. It's not one of my favorite philosophies. It comes out of the 80s, an inclination in philosophy and literature about deconstruction. And I'm going to read you one small tidbit from a quote from a writing about this. The extension to the Jewish Museum was much more than a competition and commission. It was about establishing and securing identity with Berlin, which was lost during World War II. Conceptually, Libeskind wanted to express feelings of absence, emptiness, and invisibility, expressions of disappearance of the Jewish culture. It was the act of using architecture as a means of narrative and emotion, providing visitors with an experience of the effects of the Holocaust on both the Jewish culture and the city of Berlin. Now what Mr. Libeskind did, apparently, from accounts that I've read, is that he, from the site, extended locus of points and connected them with physical places in the city where specific events related to Jewish culture and the Germans took place. He connected those, and it was those geometries that evidently led to this kind of rather kooky, that's not an architectural term, but this rather bizarre clash of shapes. It seems like an odd thing to do, But again, the whole idea of the angst of contemporary culture and contemporary life is the thing that the deconstructivists felt had to be front and center in writing, in buildings, etc. Few architects picked up on it, but Libeskind has still, I think, persisted. This is considered to, this is one of the elevations, of course, and even the language of window openings is completely different. Non-referential, nothing about floor levels, nothing about the utility. It's almost as though someone is drawing or etching a mat knife across a piece of cardboard, making a building like this, or a column that really makes no sense structurally. It's extremely expensive to do. I'm being a little editorial here when I say it. I think it's rather, well, you know what I mean. And then these clashes. I got to be careful because there are some architects out here that I can't. But to me, this is not, personally, this is not the realm of architecture, nor should it be. We should never use architecture as a canvas for angst of the human condition. It might reflect it, but to do it quite so extrovertly and directly, I find problematic. And then I'm going to conclude with this, I'm not going to call it a fetish, but there seems to be this propensity for doing a Bilbao everywhere. And I think it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. So, and I've got a wonderful summation that, even though we're at a Catholic institution, I have to show you, and you'll see why I say that in a minute. Now, the Bilbao Effect. What if we take a couple of $100 million and put a building up that no one's ever seen before? We'll attract a lot of people. Attracting a lot of people means you get a lot of hotel rooms and restaurants, and therefore the revenue stream of a down-and-out former industrial city rise. So the site for the Guggenheim, this is the Guggenheim again, which is really spreading all over the world, is next to a major roadway, but it is, I think, sensitively part of a riverfront promenade with open space, esplanades and whatnot, places of public assembly and public enjoyment. So I think in terms of siting, it certainly makes sense. It's a building, the aesthetic of which really hadn't been seen before, frankly. And if you look at the early drawings, some people think they're just sketches. He actually is an architect who will bundle up pieces of paper and photograph them, put them in the computer, and generate buildings from them. You can't do this without computers, obviously. But I'm not going to decry it. It's not my particular aesthetic, but that's irrelevant. The fact is that this town of Bilbao, this city of Bilbao, is on the map. It has had enormous success, enormous success. And I'm going to show you about, and obviously titanium panels, the geometry, the windows, all unique. The El Greco sky, I love this particular picture because if you know El Greco's paintings, I mean, there it is, right there from Spain. It really is. But the light of day will play on the metallic surface, and it will be one thing. It's like Kahn with the Yale Center for British Art talked about when he was meeting with the Board of Trustees. They said, Mr. Kahn, what's the building going to look like? And he said, well, on a gray day, it will look like a moth, and on a sunny day, it will look like a butterfly. Well, it's all stainless steel, and it's exactly what it looks like in a concrete frame. And I'm sure that Frank Gehry knew that when he picked titanium as the shingle, the surface, rather, along with the stone. But vast spaces, you can see that promenade swinging out over the water. The insides, to me, again, I haven't been here, seem pretty humdrum. I think they could be anywhere. And unlike, I think, Renzo Piano's work, where you get a sense of where you are in the world, or in Kahn's Kimball, this, I think, suffers accordingly. Now, this is the kind of thing, this is from a museum news, and you don't have to see. In 111 months, the average monthly visitation, 82,000 people. Of those, non-Basque visitors are about 80%, 65,000 plus. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, all it's really saying, it's not a heartbeat, although maybe it is economically, that in 2006, the overnight stays of foreign visitors keeps going up and up and up and up. So you can see that in the top line on the left, first year, about 260 visitors. Next year, 1.3 million. Next year, 1.1 million. Total, 9.1 million visitors. Now, as I was putting this together, I thought, well, okay, that's a good justification for a convention center, maybe to justify the 100 million you spend on the building. But what about the programs that the building does? If people come and spend an hour and buy their food and whatnot and leave, all it is increased visits. But how does that really help as a civic building? It seems to me that there are other examples of, better examples of buildings that as civic institutions serve the citizenry as being something more than like a theme building. Disneyland, for example. Disneyland has nothing else to do but to entertain people, and that's fine. It's it works very well. Now, he's saying the Bilbao Effect is bullsh. We're at the University of Scranton. The idea that one building can transform the fortunes of an entire region was totally described as BS by the architect who pioneered it. 100 million, 11 years ago. He says it's a bunch of bull. You do a building, you solve the problems, people are happy, and that's nice. However, a really successful building like the Guggenheim cannot simply be churned out to order. It's kind of a miracle. You don't quite know how it happens. And then this is the best part, I think. In the case of Bilbao, this is Frank Gehry, they asked for a Sydney Opera House when we started, but they had a comprehensive plan for the community. It wasn't just an event building. They had a comprehensive plan. Norman Foster, Sir Norman Foster, excellent British architect, did the subway system. Jim Sterling, who unfortunately passed away, great British architect, was doing a train station that never happened. Calatrava did the airport, and everybody did a vineyard. So there was a sort of an intent to change the community, and it did work. Thank you very much. A little discombobulated, but I hope some of them might be stones in the pond. You know? Heck, be happy to take questions, except from any architect. I'm not going to answer any. Yes.
In 2004, Zaha Hadid was the first female to win the Pritzker. Do you know anything about her since then?
Do I know any of the questions about Zaha Hadid, the first woman to receive the Pritzker? Do I know anything about the museum in Cincinnati? I understand it's very good. Oh, she did a small corner museum. I have not seen her work. I'm not a great fan, but that building supposedly is very, very good. It really works with the city context. I think that form for form's sake, I think has problems, and I think she represents that, like Peter Eisenman. I have to say that I was once at a lecture in Washington, and I heard Peter, this is a public lecture at the Natural History Museum, Baird Auditorium. I drew a blank. Eisenman, thank you. Did a building in Tokyo. It was an office building. And he did an office building in which the stair riser is triangular. The riser is the vertical part of the stair, so it's like a slope ramp. And people trip on it all the time. And he thought that was really terrific. I'm serious. In a public lecture. I think that is absolutely not only irresponsible, but to make light of it, he laughed at the fact it's called the tripping stair. Now, you can have people involved with your building, but not that way. But in any event, I don't know that much about Zaha Hadid, but and there are others. I happen to like Renzo Piano's work a lot, but if you go to Dallas, you have to go to the Nasher Museum. Joe Nasher's sculpture collection was put in a little five bays made of parallel walls. It extends out to a Peter Walker designed garden. It's absolutely sublime, I think. It's all glass from the street, so you can stand on the sidewalk, look out, and you see a little pavilion at the end which has a James Turrell sculpture. It's basically a square skylight where you can watch the light of the day change in a completely acoustically sealed space. It's just wonderful. It's an oasis in the city. And so what I admire since I have the podium, what I really admire about his work is he really thinks about people being in places, not just looking at them. And therein lies the problem, I think, with much architecture. It's just being done for what we see. But it's the last of those three things I put on the ball, terms or ideas or components. Buildings is place. We need better places, and architecture can help to do that. Any other questions? Concerns? Maureen? I don't know the legalities.
I don't know the architecture. So.
Good. Next. No, kidding.
How significant a departure did Gary do in Bilbao to accommodate this Bilbao effect that you talked about? Or was he inclined to do that kind of creation anyway?
Well, Frank Gehry is an interesting architect because he used to do dozens of shopping centers and commercial work, and he was very good at it. Worked for James Rouse, developer, very good American developer. It wasn't until he did his little house in Santa Monica in the Richard 70s, maybe, chain link fence, and he just, tipped windows on their side. I think he got tired of it, and he wanted to do something new. My understanding with Gary is that he did come up with a new aesthetic, very personal, that's now become emblematic of his work, but I think he did that for Bilbao. I really do. And his working method, I wasn't kidding when I talked about rolling up pieces of paper, photographing them, and putting them in. But I have to say that he was the first architect to take an aerospace computer software called CATIA and apply it to buildings. And for that, I give him huge credit. He has really moved the production side and the use of computers in a creative medium to new heights that many of us are still trying to follow, or many are still trying to follow. So I never can dismiss him as being, and his sketches just look like they're something your dog could do. But if those instruments help him do what he does, I think it's fine, because that's just personal notations, and we can all have. Michelangelo had them, and Leonardo da Vinci had them, and that's okay. I think in the world of human creative endeavor, why would it matter what the means is? It's the ends ultimately. So Bilbao is graced with an iconic building that is. But you see, now he does the Disney Hall, which is actually superb acoustically in Los Angeles. It really, really works. And there are some nice spaces, but I think it's become a little formulaic. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate your comments about what a museum can do for a whole community. On a smaller scale, or maybe a larger scale, what's going on with the Bowery in New York right now, the new museum and the other buildings that have been built within those 3 blocks have done a whole new creation of that neighborhood. And I hadn't thought about it the way you just.
The point, that's well taken, the new buildings, museums down in the Bowery. But the other thing is the High Line. This abandoned, which I have not seen yet, but I'm told that it's just it's extraordinary repurposing of an elevated portion. It goes down, goes up, and you look at the slides, and it's almost like a little swath of Central Park raised above the ground, and it is used intensely. So anything like that for the quality of life, and of course New York can sustain, you couldn't do that in Scranton. We just don't have the density, I think. So the worry I always have is that if someone takes something and says, well, that's the formula for picking up Dunmore, let's build, well, no offense to Dunmore, but let's do a Bilbao and Dunmore and we'll get the economic, it wouldn't work, just wouldn't work. So clearly Bilbao, and again, if you look at the non-Basque area visitors, 80%. 80%. Yes, ma'am.
What is your view on establishing the timeliness of a piece of architecture? And, when I think about Sullivan and all the buildings of Sullivan's that were torn down, and now you find those interiors in museums today, what buildings do you think we're going to see in museums today, portions of them?
Yes, Richard Nichols was a superb photographer and lost his life apparently when he was photographing some of those buildings being torn down in Chicago, which is, I think, one of the greatest cities in the world for Chicago, for architecture. I'll get to it in a second, but it just makes me think that when you ride a bus and you have a map, All the people want to say, you're looking for Frank Lloyd Wright, you're looking for Mies van der Rohe, you're looking for Louis Sullivan. Almost every resident knows architecture. And that's not the case usually. But anyway, I think there are a couple of questions in your question maybe. First of all, I really believe that the buildings that we hold the dearest to our hearts are the ones that have a timeliness to them. A timelessness to them, excuse me, timelessness. Oof, got that one wrong. You go into the Chicago Art Institute and you go up and look at the Louis Sullivan elevator doors on the alcove, for example, at the top of the stairs on the left, and the Frank Lloyd Wright windows and things like that. Those artifacts from buildings that are no longer economically viable, and that's usually the case, at least someone has rescued them. And I applaud the institutions for doing that. They say that some of the people now that own Frank Lloyd Wright houses, if they can sell off a couple of art glass windows, they can retire for life. So of course there are people, insensitive people, that will strip houses of those artifacts because they're so valuable. But the timely and the timeless is a whole nother discussion, and I think one that maybe we should have someday here. And I think that's true of literature, it's true of sculpture perhaps, but buildings are around for a long time, usually. They repurposed the Burnham and Roots, it was Charles Atwood's Reliance building, one of the early curtain wall buildings from the 1870s, Richard? He's my historian, 1880s, terracotta, but there's a whole Chicago school trying to get the most glass as you can on the outside. And you look at the plans, and the plans reflect when they're made. One corridor, no more than 30 feet of depth, so you can get natural light from the outside windows. That's it. And exit stairs. Now, of course, with air conditioning and lighting systems, we don't have to do that anymore, but that's why the light wells are in the middle. Now, for developers today, those building types, if you want, stock exchange, brokerage house, or insurance, they want huge plates. They want 5, 6, 7, 12,000 square foot floor plates in cities. So those kinds of floor plates aren't going to work in the old Sullivan building. But brilliant architect, brilliant. Yes?
I'm thinking
Oh.
about Hobart. Now, it's amazing to see it. We discussed it. The first time I saw it, I just couldn't stand it, and now I really like it a lot. But it didn't seem to inspire. I don't know. Did it inspire other buildings of that sort? Certainly, Piano is in a much different place. But
The question is, if you didn't hear, did the Pompidou Center, Beaubourg, inspire other similar types of buildings? I think the answer is no. Interestingly, Rogers, what's interesting is that there was a team 4, which was Norman Foster and his wife and Richard Rogers and his wife. The 4 of them, Rogers and Foster went to Yale together for postgraduate work. So they came back to England and formed a small partnership. Piano went back, I guess, to Italy, but he had and still does have I'm not going to call it a fetish for technology, but an extraordinary interest in boats, machines. I mean, Norman Foster has his own helicopter. He also loves bicycles, high what's the word I want? High performance bicycles. And so people like Piano, what I loved about the work, and I'm erring a little bit wandering, is that he wants to have things work so hard that you can get them to be minimal in dimension. Engineers work with something called safety factor safeties. If you can span it with this, they'll make it 4 times as big because it won't collapse. But I think the European architects, first of all, have access to some extraordinary talent in the engineering field, and people like Peter Rice and others that have since met their demise did a lot for the whole relationship of architectural innovation and structural engineering prowess is one that really should be undertaken. But I think I didn't answer the question. Did I? No. It sounded as though Sandra said no, but she said yes. No, I guess I didn't.
You did.
Did I?
No.
Tha-
You said no to its influence.
Oh, yeah, no. Now, see, I think people will try to replicate a Bilbao aesthetically, formally, but it will be seen as a replication, as an attempt. No, first of all, the scale of Beaubourg, Pompidou, I think it's hard to meet. I mean, when C.F. Murphy did the second part of the Chicago Convention Center, that would have had the amount of building, I think, and space requirements, but nowhere near the desire, I think, to have. It was an aesthetic that came out of a belief in a philosophy about having parts that were what they called yes, no, of the wet, dry variety. They wanted to make everything there's a difference between the permanent parts and the flexible, short-lived parts. So when they did the Lloyds of London, for example, Richard Rogers, technically the bathrooms could all be lifted out with a crane and replaced. Now that's a design idea that comes from a philosophy that could be questioned for its utility, but nonetheless it was the philosophy, the driving force behind it. If you can expose all of the pipes and mechanicals and you can take them out on the outside of the building, you can replace them more easily. You don't have to tear down all the ceilings and whatnot if you can do it. But frankly, as we architects know, that's symbolic more than actual, because there are a lot of pipe runs that have to go on in the interior of the building. Michelle, you know. That's just the bones, the veins that carry the air and the water, all that business, have to go everywhere. So you can't just mass them on the outside. But I think the aesthetic was that it was something that was, the French are the French. And it was hard at first. It was hard, but they supported. The other thing is that there's just this great swooping plaza that goes down. And it is, there are clowns, musicians. It just becomes a place to hang out. You don't even have to go to the building. It's a big backdrop for urban life. And I think that's its greatest contribution.
I think that you would call it timely and not timeless, because it did reflect a kind of mood of that time.
You're right. Yes, you're right.
Didn't carry over to other places or other times.
Now, the rhetorical question is that okay, or is that, and I think that's something we should all think about, because everything is not transportable, translatable, fortunately, I think. Now, yes, ma'am.
I'm very interested in the whole concept of a sense of place, and I was interested in what you said about the High Line in New York, sort of recreating Central Park on an industrial structure, and we have that here. You talk about what we could and could not do in an environment. How much does the natural environment restrict what you can do with the built environment, or could you do just like economic development like they did in Bilbao? Is that legitimate to just try to create a purpose, or isn't it more important for the built environment and the natural environment to build on each other? Michelle did it with our industrial history here with her parents' breaker house.
That's a difficult question to answer. Obviously, the reciprocity between natural place and man-made event or building in that place should be strong. In other words, the place should. That's why I probably unfairly label Stephen Holl's building as a what do I call it, a enclosed vessel or something like that. It's sort of self-referential. It just sits there. But that might be okay. It's like a bank vault for art. But if you look at Renzo, and I wanted to show it, but Renzo Piano is now doing a $180 million, I think, $164 million extension to the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Cambridge, in Boston, along what they call the Emerald Necklace of Frederick Law Olmsted. And it's a marvelous, I think, addition. And I've read that he didn't want to take it at first, because why should he muck around with an Italianate palace that was brought over by a wealthy heiress from Italy, stone by stone, with a remarkable collection, and add to it. But his addition is, it's got a glass greenhouse that faces the greensward that goes along that Olmsted had proposed. So there is, I think, a wonderful reciprocity between that sequence of spatial experiences in the building through the greenhouse and the place where it's built. You know, but a lot of architects wouldn't do that. And that's why I think the word PLACE is, of the ones I've showed, is best perhaps related to his work. He has that sensibility in everything he's done. I mean, I've seen only 2 or 3 of his buildings, but the ones I've seen, the Byler Museum in Basel is extraordinary. It sits on the edge of a town. It's exquisite. It's right next to a big field. And it's a wonderful place in which to view art. But you know you are in the landscape at the same time. Yeah. And Di Menil.
Very pleasing examples you cited. You don't especially stress their dimensions. It got me thinking of the Moscow of Stalin, or Albert Speer's apocalyptic vision of a post-war Herrenvolk Berlin. But getting away from this aesthetic of the gigantic, does it suggest society's maturing in some ways?
Let's see. I wish I had shown the Nasher, because it's so diminutive in size. It's like a little village of rooms in the middle, right next to Ed Barnes's museum, which pales in comparison, I think. I don't know how to answer that question. I'm afraid. I just don't know. About the size part?
Well, stress on figures.
Well, now, okay. But you see, when they added on the art, what happens is a lot of these larger museums, like the Met, MoMA in New York, Art Institute, have thousands of pieces of art that nobody can see because they don't have the space. So that Art Institute edition, I don't know how, it's a couple 100,000 square feet. I mean, I should have probably, tried to stay away from statistics like that. My mind can't handle it. No, but that's a big addition. And yet, I think you'd probably agree that it has a grandeur, but an aesthetic lightness at the same time. The Metropolitan has grandeur, but it's huge. And it says, I am a vault for cultural artifacts. And that's one of the things I admire about it, to me. But that's one of the things I admire about Piano's work, is he'll open it to the outside world, which is a very daring thing to do in the art museum world. Because, and Kahn had the same problem with the trying to get light into the Kimball. But it's magical, the way he does it, I think. Any other? Yes?
If you are familiar with it, could you comment on the De Young Museum in San Francisco?
The De Young Museum in San Francisco, yes, I've been to that. The largest copper subcontracting job in the United States. I don't know who got the contract, but those fellows are probably on their way to the Bahamas. I thought about showing that. It's a copper-clad building, and it's right opposite Piano's, I never get it straight. He did the science museums, thank you, in a park. Wonderful. One of the things that Herzog and de Meuron, the two Swiss architects that designed that, did was they completely changed the path, as I understand it, of the way you viewed exhibits. They're not sequential chronologically. And the idea is that you can cut across timelines because of the way the circulation spaces are laid out, which is quite an interesting experience. To look down on that copper roof, and I mean, every square meter is covered with copper, is extraordinary. Aesthetically, new boundaries were being pushed for that building. I know that when they did the little building in Minneapolis, the name of which escapes me at the moment, they had perforated metal exterior, and have had no end of problems with insects living inside the. It's a rain screen, and I mean, that is a problem. Architects do have immense problems with birds getting on their buildings and doing all kinds of things because they make places for it. But it's a beautiful building. It's particularly the observation tower, I think, is very nice. And yet it's quite unlike, one of the things they wanted to do is to have the patina of the copper, which will turn green, although the patination can be accelerated now, to merge with the trees. So that as it gets to have a greenish surface effect, it's going to fade into a very verdant, lushly planted site. Well, thank you all for your attention, and really appreciate it.
We were very fortunate today, wouldn't you say, in hearing this wonderful talk and the insights about civic architecture. We owe Greg a huge apology for the sunshine. We had no control over it, yeah. We could do something here, but we promise you, next time you come back, you'll be in a place where we can see your slides. So thank you very much. I want to remind all of you who are coming on the bus trip that you will today, I believe today, get your instructions about time and place to meet. And we're in for a great tour of a very, very interesting American city, Newark, New Jersey. So any of you who decide today to come, you're still welcome because there's more on the bus. You'll be hearing about that. And we'll be preparing for our next semester. I'm doing that now, and I know that you'll all be with us. So thank you very much for coming today. Remember, our next luncheon, the last in this series of World Affairs luncheons, will be on December 9th. So you have a little respite in between. So we hope to see you there. Bye-bye.